Stuart Flint, who is Associate Professor of Psychology of Obesity at University of Leeds. He's also President of the Scale Insights and Director of Obesity UK. He's going to talk on media portrayal of childhood obesity. Stuart, please. Sorry for the delay, Stuart.
Not to worry, Siba, and thanks for inviting me to present today. So, and thanks for the introduction. So, thus far, we've heard a lot so far in terms of the prevalence of childhood obesity across Greater Manchester, which in many instances mirrors what we see across the UK and, of course, actually across the world. And the prevalence of childhood obesity, of course, has increased, but so has associated health concerns. What we have probably heard less about, but has increased concomitantly alongside the prevalence of childhood obesity and obesity, of course, more generally across the population, is an increase in weight stigma and discrimination. Stigma and discrimination is experienced by children living with obesity on almost a daily basis. Children experience stigma from a range of different sources, including parents, from family members, peers, teachers, fitness instructors, and many more. But one of the key sources that has influenced the development, the maintenance as well of stigmatizing attitudes towards people and children living with obesity is the media. And in some instances, the media actually openly encourages stigma and discrimination towards people living with obesity. Now, much of this media portrayal actually reinforces stereotypes, and those stereotypes typically revolve around laziness, gluttony. It blames individuals, and in the case of childhood obesity, blames parents. Often offers simplistic solutions for overweight and obesity, which clearly is ill-aligned to the substantial evidence. In many instances, also dehumanizes people. And of course, offering simplistic solutions to what is a very complex health condition is clearly ill-aligned. And of course, what we also see is portrayal that obesity, a chronic health condition. In all the definitions of obesity, the word chronic is included, yet solutions presented in the media are often acute. And that doesn't make sense. You can't solve a health condition, a chronic health condition, with an acute solution, but that's what's presented to the public. So what ultimately happens is they contribute to inaccurate perceptions of what obesity is, and of course what potential management techniques could be out there that could be useful in at least the timeframes. What I should also mention here, which is very relevant to today's topic, is that stigma is not only directed at individuals, but also towards weight management and obesity services. What I quickly want to highlight before we move on, of course, as well, is that, and I guess the reason for really highlighting this topic is that we need to quash the misconception in society that stigma can be beneficial. It's not beneficial. Actually, the substantial evidence here tells us that experiences of stigma leads to or associated with physical and mental health concerns. So we know that it's associated with, for instance, depression, anxiety, lowered self-esteem, lowered self-confidence. But we also know its experiences of stigma are associated with increased cardiometabolic risk factors. But beyond that, we also know that these types of experiences lead to maladaptive behaviors. So what I'm referring to there is that reduces the likelihood that people will engage in health-seeking behaviors, reduces, in some instances, physical activity and exercise, and can also lead to poorer eating behavior. And very finally, what I also want to highlight is something that I've been talking to many governments about over the last decade, is that you can have national policies and you can have healthcare policies and so on, but ultimately very, very few, probably less than 1% of the population, of the general population, read these types of documents and these information. What people actually read is the media portrayal, the cherry picking of information, and in many instances, the inaccurate and disrespectful portrayal of people living with obesity. And a good example here is the soft drinks industry levy, of course, which was brought in as part of the Childhood Obesity Action Plan. Very, very few percentage of this population will have read that policy. But from day one, the public were told that the policy was never going to work. There was inaccurate information presented. There were stereotypes presented. But ultimately, what this has led to in the population is a blaming of people living with obesity. i.e. the rhetoric that the reason I now have to pay more for soft drinks is because of people living with obesity, because people living with obesity can't control themselves, etc. That is the rhetoric, and that is ultimately impacting the situation that we have. Please flick on to the next slide. So this topic's great from my perspective in terms of what I can talk to, because actually it was media portrayal where my journey started here in terms of weight stigma discrimination. Now, fat jokes, derogatory portrayals are very common in the media. We see that across all types of media, and in many instances, we're also given a message that it's acceptable to stigmatize people based on body shape, size, appearance, and so on. As I mentioned, this was where my journey started, 2007, and there was a lot of different media pieces out about obesity, and childhood obesity was really focused on at that time point. And I came across this newspaper article that used the title, "The fattest boy in the world weighs 16 stone, age 7." The article then went on to pose the question to readers, think British kids are getting a bit porky, then take a look at this Russian tank. There was lots of stigmatizing content and stereotypical information, and they made comparisons between the boy's weight and a baby elephant. But what we can see here is the active dehumanization of this individual, in this instance, a child. And this is going out to millions of people across the UK. So, there's clearly a major influence that media might have. And of course, they have the reach to meet millions and millions of people. So that's the importance of media. Next slide, please. What I should also highlight here is that media portrayal is also leveled at people's age. And you can see actually there's different types of stereotypes, for instance, that are very evident in media portrayal that is depicted to people of different age groups. Now, we know that children as young as 3 are reporting stereotypes about people or characters living with obesity. So the content that children from a very early age see often revolve around stereotypes such as laziness or being slow. As children move into primary school age, the types of stereotypes they see in their media are again around laziness, but more so around gluttony, and also being socially inept, so lacking friends, not being a very good friendship choice. Obviously, these are really key things for children at that age, but that's what the media depicts obesity as. Into teenage years, you then have lacking intelligence, you have being physically unattractive, and as you move into later teens and into adulthood, being sexually undesirable. So even the stereotypes around obesity are framed to people based on the kind of life course that we often see. And so those fat jokes are very evident within media, and a lot of that is very blatant. But actually, in some instances, it's also ingrained and unconscious. So what we also see here is that people living with obesity or characters on TV typically have much more negative experiences compared to normal weight counterparts who appear. So they're less likely to have positive outcomes, less likely to have romantic relationships. They're less likely to have the kind of higher powered jobs or jobs that are higher paid. And these are unconscious stigmas and stereotypes that are transcended to viewers or readers. So there's both blatant and kind of unconscious stigmas that we see in the media. Next slide, please. Now, I can't move on without talking about kind of reality weight loss TV programs and other. These have, of course, become more so typically since the kind of turn of the century. So around about 2000 onwards, we saw many more reality TV programs. And over the last maybe 5 to 6 years, we've seen a lot more around families and children. And a lot of this content is extremely stigmatizing, reinforces a lot of stereotypes. And what we actually know is that exposure to these types of TV programs and the way that they're framed and the narrative about obesity, the stereotypical information about the causes of obesity are actually very detrimental. And there's quite a bit of work that's been done on this program, which you'll all, I'm sure, be familiar with, which even by the very title itself is stigmatizing. It's telling us that people living with obesity are losers ultimately. This is about the biggest loser. This is the TV program. And what we actually know is that exposure to this program leads to many negative outcomes, some of which I've highlighted here on the slide. So people become more concerned with weight, and of course, that focus on weight can be really detrimental. And we actually do know that we need to be thinking much more holistically about health and well-being more generally in terms of how to support people. That's more likely to lead to more engagement, better outcomes, and ultimately better well-being. We know that it's also associated with increased dislike of people living with obesity, increased anti-fat attitudes, stronger beliefs that weight is controllable. And of course, this is a key piece here, because the more that we believe obesity is controllable, the more likely we are to blame people, to assign blame to people, and ultimately we know that that's associated with anti-fat attitudes. But of course, and again, I don't have time to talk about this, we know there are many, many different factors that contribute to obesity. Back in 2007, the Foresight report told us over 100 different factors contributes to obesity. It's multi-level, multi-component, it's extremely complex. Some of those factors are either wholly or partially outside of people's control. So that's key there. And then finally, as I've mentioned before, of course, this type of exposure also leads to lower motivation to exercise. Next slide, please. I want to give you a couple of examples here of the types of content that's gone out, and really to kind of go back to some of the points I made right at the start in terms of inaccuracies about media portrayal. This is a newspaper article, media portrayal, newspaper article, and this article was about the National Child Measurement Programme data. Now, what happened here, and this was back in 2018, is Public Health England released some figures about the childhood obesity prevalence across England. They just released the data. Okay, so it was a table. There was no other information. It was a table with a bit of description. The paper picked it up. And what I want to highlight here is inaccuracies. So there's lots of stereotypes about some people in obesity. You can see in the title, they're talking about prevalence across Britain. Well, that's inaccurate for a start. This program is only delivered across England. Later on in the article, they talk about the program being delivered across the UK. It's inaccurate, so there's inaccuracies actually in the description of what the program is. They created this map here on the top right. This was created by the newspaper. It's not from Public Health England. From the very title, it's almost trying to shame or blame certain areas. So where are the areas where the fattest children are in reception? Almost as if we need to go and shame these different areas. The little icons that you can see, there's red icons, there's green icons. The red icons are supposed to represent a person living with obesity, and the green normal weight. But that's inaccurate as well. So these are all levels of childhood obesity. The green icons that are representing normal, it's not normal weight, it's just a lower prevalence of of childhood obesity. And then, of course, there is the stereotypical and stigmatizing image of a person with obesity, which is included in this case of the child. It's focused on typically the stomach or the abdomen area. They cut the heads off people. And of course, why do you cut the heads off people in images? What it ultimately means is that you don't get an identity towards the person. So they're actually de-identifying people here. And what is typically shown in these types of images is a reinforcement of gluttony or consumption of fast food and so on. So most of the images that you actually see, although I'm not showing it here, that you typically see in media portrayal is where the person is consuming some kind of fast food, which again is reinforcing that type of that stereotype. Next slide, please. The other example that I just want to quickly use here, I did a bit of work for European Congress on obesity over the few years, and this is some of the portrayal that I picked up in 2019, which was based on the research that's being presented at the Congress. So these are a couple of articles. You can see the stigmatizing images across the bottom that was included. Here you can really see that there's blame towards several different people, many of which is about blaming parents, suggesting that parents are in denial, that parents are to blame. You even have information where you're blaming doctors. So here you see on the left, doctors and even children, guilty of underestimating obesity. There's the terminology that's used here ultimately is very alarmist. It's really raising people's concerns, and the stigmatizing comments and terminology is used here. Tubby, whopping, and there's a play on the kind of titles and words here as well in terms of face the facts and fat law of good, etc. So media will really provide not only inaccurate information but very stigmatizing content, even when it's based on possibly research or medical outputs. Next slide, please. Now, I can't move on without talking about social media. Social media, of course, has become very key in terms of what children engage with. And actually, it's also one space where people receive a lot of media content now. So media content from newspapers and so on, radio shows, etc. This was a study that was conducted in 2016, and it was looking at tweet content. A very simple study, but really highlights the amount of content that's going out in social media about this topic. So they look for tweets that had the word fats within a 4-hour time frame. You can see how many tweets were recorded there, 4,500. Of those 4,500, approximately 57% were negative, 32 neutral. And of those containing weight stigmatizing messages, which were 529, you can see the themes there. These themes are the stereotypes that I've already talked about here. So gluttony, unattractiveness, not being sexually desirable, being sedentary, laziness, stupid. So this is being reinforced through the various different platforms that we now associate with the media and what the media are using to disseminate information to the public through. I think if you flick on, there's another piece, a couple of images on this slide. And this is also what I want to quickly highlight here is it's not just the media now that are disseminating stigmatizing information to people. It's also influencers and celebrities and other, which could be the example on the left there from Katie Hopkins. And then these two here are also academics. So we also have academics who stigmatize people, healthcare professionals who stigmatize people. And actually this platform is allowing people to disseminate stigmatizing information to the public. And this is important because, as I say, younger people are engaging with social media, and this is the types of information they're receiving. I mentioned right at the start the detrimental impact that stigma has on young people, adolescents, and so on. Next slide, please. And so what I want to quickly summarize is that media portrayal clearly is extremely important. It influences people's perceptions of obesity. It contributes to the development of stigmatizing attitudes. In many instances, encourages discrimination. And those stereotypes that are evident towards people with obesity are framed to the public across the life course. Often the portrayal is inaccurate, it's unfair, it's disrespectful, and this is critically important because it's impacting people's engagement in health-related behaviors, it's impacting people's engagement in with healthcare and potentially services or treatment that could be beneficial. The media blame children, and through children and childhood obesity, blame parents living with obesity. And these experiences are extremely detrimental and extremely harmful, as I've mentioned. So there's clearly an importance of improving media portrayal. And what I would finally just say here is, whilst I see media as probably being one of the most important vehicles of information that we need to change, that can be beneficial right across society, they've been one of the vehicles that ultimately have contributed to stigma. If you shift media portrayal, this can have a really beneficial impact. And we've seen that in the past. And let me probably give you a quick example, which is that stigma and discrimination towards people living with HIV in the past was extremely high. It still is high now, but was much worse. And one of the key differences where we started to see stigma decrease towards people living with HIV was when the media changed their rhetoric, changed their narrative, and actually really supported messages to increase people's awareness and education that actually HIV AIDS is not just about people who may have unprotected sex and therefore that rhetoric around irresponsibility, but actually they were really key in terms of upping people's awareness that HIV AIDS could also be through passing on through blood transfusions, rape, from passing on at birth. So the media can be a key vehicle in changing. And my very final piece that I just want to quickly mention is that we need to change the narrative in the media, but also in many other instances. And I would include in there what we're doing as healthcare professionals, what we're doing as academics, what we're doing as the government in terms of policies. The two really key pieces of information that I like to show, which highlights that we need to change the narrative around obesity, is when I compare the narrative we use for cancer and the narrative we use for obesity. So the narrative around cancer is one where we talk about people living with a cancer, people living with cancer as part of a family. We talk about people living with cancer as survivors. There's lots of support that's available. We're very supportive there, but that narrative ultimately is transcending the emotions of hope and optimism to people. And that's key. That's exactly what we want to be doing as healthcare professionals. That's exactly what we want the media to do. That's exactly what we want to see in policy. But if you compare that to the rhetoric and the narrative around obesity, it's totally the opposite. It's pessimistic. It increases fear. We talk about obesity as a burden. It's that the emotions that we're transcending to people about obesity is ones that is very pessimistic and increases anxiety and fear. But what that does is it leads to frustration and despair. Now, hope and optimism are key in terms of behavior change. Hope and optimism are more likely to lead to people engaging in health-related behaviors, engaging with services and so on. And that's why the narrative around cancer is much better. The narrative around obesity that is pessimistic, etc., that does not lead to engagement in health-related behaviors. It leads to frustration, despair, and so on. And so that narrative needs to change to match the narratives that we see towards other health conditions. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.